Hello and welcome to Your Coaching Journey, a podcast for doctors about coaching. Whether you're a coaching doctor, a doctor who is learning to coach, or a doctor who'd like to build coaching into your professional life, then this is the podcast for you. Hello, I'm Tom Dillon, and with me today is my co-host and business partner, Helen Leathers. Hi, Helen, how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well. I think people are getting fed up of me saying I'm very well, but I am very well. So we're going to carry on. As long as I'm well, I will keep saying it. Today, we have another of our Q&A sessions. So we have questions that our listeners have sent in to us. So let's crack on and take a look at our first question.
Yes, so Jennifer, a GP and someone who's currently training as a coach, has asked us this question. When I'm practicing coaching, I find myself thinking about what my next question is going to be, which means I'm not really listening as deeply as I should or could be. How can I be more present and not worry about what to say next?
I think this is quite a common problem for coaches because we think far faster than people can speak. So people generally speak 85 to 100 words a minute, but in a coaching session they're probably thinking as they're speaking, so the pace of speech is much slower, so we have much more time available to us to be thinking and thinking ahead whilst they're speaking. So we'll fill in the blanks, and we'll think we know where they're going with the story, we'll project a little bit, and we will start to think of questions. We'll think of where the coaching session is going to go. So my way of dealing with this is just to pause all of that thinking. Let the questions come, let them go, let them move on past me, and just stick with what's being said by the coachee. So just focus on what is being said by them. And the best way to focus on that is to think about how you're going to play back what has just been said. So it might be that you're going to summarise. So if they talk for 5 minutes, you might want to capture the essence of what's being said and just summarise. Or it might be that they've said a really significant word, or they've used a really powerful metaphor, and you're just going to play that back. So it's just focusing on something that you can play back to them at the end of their monologue so that it buys you some time, so you can do some really good thinking once you've played back. They are then thinking about what you've just played back. So there's a lovely space that's created in that moment where you can do some more thinking and actually think about a question you want to ask, and they can do some thinking too. And it might well be that in doing their thinking, they will just carry on speaking. And you might never have to ask a question. They might just carry on with their thoughts.
And of course, not to be scared of that silence in between someone finishing and you asking a question.
Yeah, and the silence is the space where all the magic happens. That's where they will carry on doing their thinking. And I guess we become really good at noticing when someone is actually thinking. And when they finish thinking and they're looking back to us to move the conversation on. So I think just calibrating with that. If we know that when they're thinking they look up to the left, if we can pick out that, we can just sit comfortably, know that they're thinking, and not rush to get involved. Just leave them to their thinking.
And we have to differentiate between the everyday and the coaching space, because we're so keen, I think, generally to fill the gaps when we're with other people in the everyday. So we have to remember we don't need to do that in the coaching room.
Yeah, there's very little space in normal everyday conversations. And even to the point that some people will finish your sentence for you. You won't even get they'll say the last word out loud with you. So yeah, it's not a normal way to be in everyday conversation. But we're in a coaching session, we're having a coaching conversation. Whilst it is a conversation, it's different to a normal conversation. And we really want to build in that space that's going to allow for that generation of new thinking on the part of the coachee.
Well, Jennifer, and any other coaches who are in training or perhaps qualified and still concerned with this, hopefully that's helped give you some thought.
Yes, indeed. And I find myself, questions will pop into my head whilst I'm coaching. And again, I just let them come, I let them go, and I wait until we've got that space where the coachee's starting to think again, and I can then start to think about the next question.
So our next question comes from Ben. He's a GP and a trainer, and he asks, within my role as a trainer, I obviously teach people models and tools, such as a prioritisation matrix to help with workload. I'd like to use them in my coaching. How can I introduce this without being directive?
Good question.
Really good question.
Good question, and I think it's tricky because I think when you start to introduce models and tools and techniques, it's very easy for that to then morph into being directive. And I think we have to draw the distinction between sharing information and sharing some awareness of models and telling people how they should be using them and where they should be on the model. I'll quite often talk about models that come from different approaches that we use in our coaching. And I might introduce a model and just show it to someone and then ask them where they think they are on the model. Obviously, if you're using a prioritization matrix, this is normally, the labels around that are normally around what's important and what's urgent and not important, not urgent. And so you might introduce that as a model and ask them where they're falling down with that, where they think the problems arise for them.
So introducing it and then having a coaching conversation around it rather than teaching about how it's used.
Yeah, so we're being directive about the process. So introducing a model, that's part of the process, but we're not being directive in terms of telling them how they should be doing things. So I think that's perfectly in order to introduce models. And say we use quite a lot of psychological models, so there's a bit of psychoeducation going on just to increase people's awareness of things they just don't know anything about. And we could sit there having a coaching conversation with them for days and they would never come up with some of the things that we're aware of that we might introduce as a useful piece of information for them.
Absolutely. And we believe as coaches that everyone has the answers within themselves and they have resources to help themselves. But I am of the belief that there are always new resources available, and it's how we have that conversation in the coaching room, really, isn't it?
Absolutely. And so if we take that prioritisation matrix, we're not going to be telling them, okay, you need to be dealing with this stuff that's important and forget the urgent stuff. We're going to be leaving it up to them to think, for them to think through that and to decide what's right for them.
Excellent. Well, hopefully that answers Ben's question.
Hopefully.
And maybe gives some other coaches some ideas if they are thinking along similar lines.
Yeah.
Excellent. Our next question is from Gemma, who's an anaesthetist and student coach, and she's emailed us to say, I have a practice client who has talked the whole way through the first session with me about their problem, and it doesn't feel as though we've achieved anything. Should I be interrupting them in order to move on? I just don't feel like I did any actual coaching. This is an interesting one, isn't it? And I'm sure you've got some thoughts on this, Tom.
Yeah, it is interesting, and I think it's quite easy to leave a session thinking, well, what did I actually do in that session? I wasn't really taking part. But obviously, if we're holding that space for someone and allowing them to just talk through their situation, they're going to gain some benefit from just saying the words out loud. So they're going to have an increased awareness of their situation just by telling us about it. And it may be that it's a really complex situation and they just have to get it off their chest. So I'm never going to interrupt someone whilst they're telling their story. I will let them tell me all about it, and if that takes an hour, that takes an hour. Now, if they come back the following week and tell me the same story, then we might be finding a point where they pause for a breath or something, where we can start to unpick it a little bit and really get underneath what's going on for them. But in that first, and it probably is the first session, that is a time for people just to unload, to let us know what's going on for them. And I certainly can recall a session during lockdown where someone just came and she cried through most of it. Not only did she talk through most of the session, she also cried through most of the session. So there was little point in me trying to get involved. And we had about 10 minutes at the end of an hour-long session where I was able to talk about how coaching might help and what we might do in future sessions and the conversations we might have. And she came back a different person for the second session. She had that chance to tell her story. Someone listened to her, which is unusual, isn't it? Normally, if someone has a problem, the first thing anyone else listening is going to do is going to interrupt. They're going to get in the way and go, oh, well, no, you need to stop thinking like that.
Oh, yes, I've done the same thing. Yeah.
So it's not unusual for people to talk a lot in the first session, and we are going to listen. We're going to pay attention to what's being said. We'll perhaps pick out some of the discrepancies in what's being said because People often contradict themselves as they're telling their story. So we're going to hang on to all of that stuff, but we're going to let them take as long as they need to tell their story.
And not interrupt.
And not interrupt.
It's very unusual for people to be truly listened to, deeply listened to in the everyday. And that's the beauty of our coaching space, isn't it? To provide that.
It is a lovely space. And on the coaching program that we have, I will often be coached. I will take part in coaching trios just to kind of make up the numbers. And people will coach me. And quite often, they'll have to sit and listen to me talk for 10 minutes. And it's not because I want the airspace. I just want to say my thoughts out loud. I make sense of things by talking about them. So I've just got 10 minutes just to think it through. And it's not indulgent. I'm not looking for anything from there. I just want to say the words out loud. And in doing that, I do new thinking and thoughts come to me and I make sense of my world. And that's a really powerful space. And what happens if people start to get in the way, if they start to interrupt, I get a little bit annoyed about that.
Yeah, and we don't want to get annoyed.
No.
We don't want our coachee to get annoyed with us. And this is linking very much into that person-centred approach to coaching that we talked about in episode 2. That space to listen and reflect back if we can.
Yeah, and underpinning all of my coaching is that person-centred approach. So that's my default setting is a person-centred approach. When I feel like we need to do something else, then I'll introduce other approaches in that integrative way that I've talked about in the past. But underpinning it all is that person-centred approach where we're listening to what's going on in front of us.
Excellent. And linked into this, I think you have a question from another listener that might add something to what we've just said.
I do. Alex, who is a GP, an appraiser, a mentor and a trainer.
He's busy.
He's busy. And now a coach. As well as a new coach, has asked about something that's probably going to come up for all coaches at some time, but he's got someone he's working with who is quite reserved and he doesn't say an awful lot, so there's lots of silence in the sessions and he's feeling a little bit uncomfortable in the sessions. So he's asking how he can go about not filling the space.
Okay, so it's almost the reverse of Gemma's problem that she felt she had with her client talking the whole way through and she didn't feel like she got much coaching done. And this person is very quiet.
Yeah.
And I think this links into what you were saying earlier, that when you're coached, you talk things through. And we know this is because you're an extrovert, and extroverts think by talking out loud. And the chances are, I'm going to guess, that this client, for Alex, is probably an introvert. So Alex is asking a question and their client is thinking and doing their processing in their mind before answering the question. So the key here, Alex, is to give them that space. Absolutely. Don't feel that you have to reframe your question. Don't feel you have to jump in. Just give them that space, because the minute that you jump in, you're stopping their thinking, in the same way that if you interrupt someone who's speaking, who's perhaps an extrovert and thinking out loud. I know that I used to always coach extroverts, and at some point during lockdown, somehow, I started coaching people who were more introverted, and it took a little while for me to get used to that difference in my approach. And I remember we had a conversation about how to do that and how to give them that space. And when you've worked with someone for a while, you can start to see their thinking process, and they will have a process, and you just have to give them that extra time. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think it is just that calibrating what's going on for them. So over time, you start to recognise that if they're looking up to the left, I always look up to my left, I don't know why. I don't know what that's about.
Me too.
But when I'm thinking, I always look up to my left. And then when I've stopped, I look back at the person in front of me. So they'll know that I finished thinking because I've come back to them. And I had the same with a professor I was coaching. It was my first engagement after lockdown, first person I sat with face to face. And again, he was very reserved. He sat and thought for a long time, but he would look away whilst he was thinking. And I knew there was no point in getting involved, that he was still engaged in doing some thinking, so I was happy to leave him to it. Now, it was my first engagement back after lockdown, so it was a little bit strange to be in a room with someone who wasn't actually speaking. But, I just settled into it and knew that that's the process he was going through. I think one thing that came to mind around Alex is just for Alex to check, and it might be worth him doing some peer coaching where he's being observed or recording himself coaching, just to check that he's not asking closed questions.
Oh, good point.
Because if he's saying, so, can you think of a time when you've done this? And the other person just goes, no. Then that's maybe why they might not be reserved. They might just be asked lots of closed questions. So I'd encourage Alex to check in on his coaching questions and make sure that he's asking good, crisp, open questions that allow the coachee to pause and think and come back with an expansive answer.
Yeah, and probably it's a good idea, like you say, to record that session or practice with someone, because we don't always know when we're doing it.
Yeah.
And we've talked about closed questions in a previous episode.
Yeah.
So
and interestingly, I've got a coachee at the moment who has asked me to record the coaching sessions for her. She can't remember what she said during a coaching session, so she wants me to send her the recording so that she can listen to it back. And I always listen to it just to make sure that it's okay before I send it off. And it is interesting to listen to yourself coaching and to make, I don't ask closed questions these days, but if you are at the beginning of your journey, it might well be that you ask a lot of closed questions. That's not unusual for coaches starting out. So I think just checking in to make sure that's the case. But otherwise, if we have someone that is just reserved, and I think some of that might also be a trust thing, that in the early days of your coaching with someone new, they might be just withholding because they don't know you very well and you haven't built that rapport and there isn't the trust there for them to share, absolutely. So I think more work on the rapport building to encourage them to say more would be good, but also recognising, as we say, that it might just be a personality thing, that they might just be introverted and think more than they speak.
excellent.
We have a doctor who actually wishes to remain anonymous, which is absolutely fine by us, but they've got in touch to say they're not sure if coaching is for them, but they'd be interested to try it out. So how could they go about doing that?
We do have the opportunity for doctors to have some coaching with our students. We offer 3 free hour-long sessions with our trained student coaches who are looking to complete their practice hours. So they've undergone all the training, but they're just completing their practice hours for their full qualification. So if Anonymous would like to try out coaching, this is a really great opportunity to do that, to see if it's for them. And we're going to put a link in the show notes to our form that doctors can complete, and then we can pop you on our waiting list and hopefully pair you up with one of our students that have completed the course and looking for some extra coaching hours. So hopefully that will help.
Yeah, and just to emphasise, these are doctors that have gone through our Doctor's Transformational Coaching Diploma. So you will be being coached by a doctor who has been trained to be a coach.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. So that's our second Q&A session. We'll be doing this on a regular basis. So if you do have any questions, do send them in to us and we'll be happy to include them in one of our future episodes. Next time on our podcast, we will be... What are we doing next time, Helen?
We'll be exploring more of the sometimes controversial elements to coaching, and we'll be posing the question, is it ever okay to mentor in a coaching session?
That's a good question.
It's a good question.
I look forward to that. I have some views.
I'm sure you do.
I do.
So we'll see you next time.
Yes. Thank you, Helen.
Bye for now.
Bye for now.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.